Hello everyone, I'm Komal Sahai. In this video, we are going to talk about inflation. Inflation is something that is extremely relevant for everyone, for students, for policymakers, as well as for people because it's very real. It affects everyone almost in real time. Okay, so let's get to it. These are the topics that we're going to talk about. These basically will break down inflation for you in simpler terms, and one by one you'll get the hang of it. Okay, so we'll start with what inflation is. We'll move on to whether it's a micro or a macro concept. Then we'll go on to discuss how inflation is measured. Next, we will discuss the types of inflation, which will basically be based on what causes a particular instance of inflation. And finally, we'll discuss a couple of terms that are related to inflation but often cause some confusion, so we're going to get that out of our way. Alright, so let's begin. Let's begin with what inflation is. So inflation is basically a general rise, a rise in the general level of prices. Okay, so it is an overall increase in the level of prices, a general increase in the level of prices. What it basically means that the purchasing power of the currency has gone down, right? So in general increase in the level of prices over a particular period of time in an economy, of course. So it means that the purchasing power of whatever currency you're using, in India, for example, we have rupee. So it means that the purchasing power of every unit of rupee has gone down. So if, for example, in the previous year, you could buy something for 100 rupees, you could buy, say, 5 kg of something for 100 rupees. Now you can buy less than 5 kg, probably 4.5, probably 4, probably 3, depending on how severe the inflation is, how much the inflation is. You will be able to buy lesser quantity of the same thing, right, with the same amount of money. Okay, so that is what the general idea about inflation is. It reduces the purchasing power of whatever currency you're using. It reflects, it's a reflection of, it's a measure of an increase in the general price level. So given this information, what is it? Is it a micro or a macro concept? Now it's an easy one, right? So we are talking about the level of prices, right? Multiple prices, the general price level. And that means that we are not talking about a particular industry, we are not talking about a particular product, we are talking about the aggregate. And whenever it's aggregate, we know that it's a macro concept. It's a concept that talks about the general economy, the economy as a whole. So it's a macro concept, not something that is looked upon from the point of view of an individual unit. Okay, so now that we have an idea, now that we know in abstract what inflation is, the next thing we need to consider is how to measure it. So the basic requirement for measuring inflation is what? Inflation is rise, which basically means that we have to measure change in the level of prices. This is our variable. So we want to measure change in a variable, and that the basic requirement then is to measure the variable. So once we have two values of the variable, we can easily calculate the change, and that will give us the value of inflation. So then, how do we measure the level of prices? We all know we measure it using some kind of a price index. A price index is what? It's the aggregate of prices compared to some base year. So if the base year, for example, is say 2010, and we want to measure prices in the current year, let's say the previous year, which is 2023. So then any price index, whichever formula you use, there are multiple available depending on the pros and cons of whichever you want to consider. I'll not get into the details of that. There's another, it requires another video for that. Okay. So the base year, if it is 2010, then any price index that you use will set the price in the base year as 100. And then whatever is your current year, or whichever year you want to measure your prices relative to the base year, it will be in relation to this 100. So if into 2023 your price is 8.3, it means that if prices in 2010 were 100, prices in 2023 were 103. Higher prices. So this reflects inflation. And then simply, if we want to measure the rate of inflation, we have price index in 2023 minus the price index in base year divided by the price index in base year into 100. Right? So then what we will get is this 100 and 100 will cancel. We'll get an inflation of 8.3%. Okay, so this is very simple how inflation is measured. The tough part, of course, is to measure the price index because it's an aggregate of thousands of prices, and it also involves the quantities of those prices, those products, right? So that's the tough part. Once you have that, the inflation is relatively easier to measure. So of course, we don't have to measure it right now. We have to understand what, if we are given a figure of say 8.3, what it means. So it means that relative to the base year or relative to any year that we are measuring. Suppose we had, this is the base year, and then you had one previous or intermediate year as 2022, right, where prices were say 105.7, then you can also measure the inflation between these 2 years. Okay, once you fix the base year, these figures will all be comparable. It will be comparable between these two, between these two, between these two, any of these two. Alright. So then this is how inflation is basically measured. Now the kind of inflation, so we know that there are different price indices based on the kind of based on the basket of goods that that is considered in any price index. So we have our consumer price index, right, the CPI, consumer price index. We have our wholesale price index or the producer price index. Generally it's the same in most economies. We also have the GDP deflator. So GDP deflator is basically all the goods and services produced in an economy in a year. Consumer price index is a subset. This is also a subset. This will include your intermediates, while this will include the basket of final goods and services. Okay. Now, depending on that, whatever inflation figure is derived, that, so most often what you will hear, two kinds of inflation that are most often reported in the media. One is what is called the headline inflation. So headline inflation is the inflation figure which is based on CPI. Okay, so this is based on CPI, the raw inflation figure based on CPI. The other, so basically comparing the CPI of 2 years, taking the difference, dividing by the starting year, the previous year, multiplying by 100. The same formula. And the second term that you may be hearing is what is core inflation. So core inflation is basically when you remove two volatile sectors from the basket of goods and services, and those two sectors are food and energy. So items from the food and energy sector are removed. Why? Because these two sectors are very volatile in terms of prices. Their prices depends on a lot of things along the supply chain, and they can be very volatile depending on, for example, fuel can be very volatile depending, because most of the fuel in India is imported, right? 85%. So then it becomes very volatile, it becomes very sensitive to movements or to developments in the world. It is also very sensitive to taxes, right? Similarly, food production is very sensitive to climate, it's sensitive to the kind of harvest that people have. So there are a lot of moving factors, therefore these are volatile, and once we remove them from our basket of goods and services, then once we compare prices between 2 years, what we get is called core inflation, because it kind of reflects a long-term pattern of inflation without these extreme volatilities. Okay, sometimes even gold and silver items are removed from this basket, and that gives us super core inflation. Okay? So basically saying that whatever excessively volatile items, we want to see inflation in a long-term pattern and not be bogged down by these extreme movements. Okay. Alright, so now we have covered how inflation is measured and what these different kinds of headline inflation, core inflation, super core inflation, what all these mean. So now let's move to what are the types of inflation. What are the types of inflation? So to understand that, types of inflation are basically based on the reason which lies behind a particular instance of inflation. So think about it. The easiest way to think about it is that what is inflation? Inflation is a change in prices, right? What is price? Price in an economy is a reflection of the value of a product, of a good, of a service, anything. Right? It doesn't matter that it may not be an accurate reflection of the actual value of something. It's just important that it reflects the value of something. It can be actual value, it can be perceived value, that doesn't matter. Okay, so price is a reflection of the value of a particular good in the economy. And then all you need to think is what can change that value? What can bring movements in that value, the perceived or the actual value? Okay, so whatever changes that will change the price, and that will lead to whatever kind of inflation. So there are two ways in which prices can increase. The first is a demand pull. And the second is a cost push. Cost push. So you can think that there is, this is prices. It can move in the upward direction because we are talking about inflation. It can move in the upward direction due to two reasons. It can either be pulled up, right? It can be pulled up by some force here, or it can be pushed up. Two kinds of movements can happen. If it's being pulled up, it's called a demand pull, because of course if something is raising the value of good, it means that its demand is increasing. But if something is increasing it from the supply side, then it's the cost push. Okay, so let's discuss each of these one by one. So demand pull is basically when demand is pulling up the prices. So you have for a given supply of products, the demand is increasing. What it essentially means is that the aggregate demand is greater than the aggregate supply. Demand is greater than supply, the basic economic concept. So when this happens, prices will increase because the supply hasn't responded in the short term, or for whatever reason it hasn't responded. So what kind of things can cause a demand pull inflation? One you can think is that say the general standard of living of people has gone up. So people are now, they have more income, but for some reason the supply is at the same level. So then these people, they have more money, they will demand more of the existing goods and services. Since that is fixed, these higher demand will pull up the prices of these goods and services. Similarly, if the tax rates are lower, so people have more disposable income, again it will be a demand pull inflation. A loose monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, higher government spending, all these things will increase demand, right? And it will lead to a pull up in prices. So these kind of forces that act to increase prices that lead to inflation are called demand pull inflation. The second one is cost push, right? So cost, what goes in any in the production of anything? Inputs, right? Inputs. So inputs, land, labor, capital. If the prices of these things go up, the cost of production of the same unit will also go up. And of course, what will the producer do? They will transfer the increase in prices onto the customers. Right? So then anything that increases the value or the price of intermediates increases the cost of production, and this increased cost pushes up the prices, and we get cost push inflation. Again, what kind of factors can lead to this? For example, higher taxes, right? Higher indirect taxes. So when you have higher indirect taxes, there will be tax to be paid on every level of production, on all intermediate goods, right? So then production will become costlier. A tighter monetary policy, your interest rates will be higher, it will be more costlier for firms to get funds, right? Again, costs will be higher. If say the labor cost goes up, or say the most common example these days is kind of unfolding before us right now, right? So when there was Ukraine-Russia war, when it started, when there were sanctions on Russia, that was one reason. So that it turned out differently for India, but definitely the sanctions on Russia meant that the crude oil will become costlier, right? And because crude oil and that's an input in almost everything, that will lead to a cost push. Again, the recent, you must have read in the news that there are attacks in the Red Sea by Houthis from Iran. So what they're doing is they are increasing the cost of the freight of the whatever is going through that route in many ways. So first, it could be that some of the cargo is lost, right? So that increases cost. Maybe the ships have to employ some sort of military for their protection. Again, goes into their cost. Maybe they have to take a longer route through, the Cape of Good Hope. They cannot take the short route. Higher flight costs, higher journey costs. So everything increases the cost. So if factors like these are increasing the cost, this is a cost push inflation. Now there's also a third kind of inflation, which is basically which can have components of both demand pull and cost push, which is called structural or built-in inflation. So what this means is that this is so whatever factors lie in this category are more permanent in nature. They can be both from the demand side, they can be both from the supply side, but the idea is that it's more permanent. So for example, if a country has a weak infrastructural system, the roads are bad, or the connectivity is poor, the supply chain, or for any product, if the supply chain is weak, so then of course, these all things are adding to the cost of production. So these are cost push. But what makes them come into this category is that they are more permanent in nature. They require changes at the structural level. They require more changes rather than a simple tweaking in the policy. Another example could be that suppose a country has, the government of a country or the laws in a country does not prohibit the government to finance its debts by just printing more money. So suppose the government is just financing its debts by printing more money via the central bank. So that just means that the money supply is increasing. Now it's a demand pull sort of inflation that will happen in this case. But the kind of change that is required is at a structural level. It has an institutional level. Some bill needs to be introduced, right? And then this kind of inflation can be handled. All right. So that's the third kind of inflation, which is structural or built-in inflation. Now, having discussed the three major kinds of inflation, types of inflation based on what causes that inflation, let's finally just discuss two terms that are, commonly used together with inflation and they confuse us. So the first term is what is called disinflation. Okay, and the second is deflation. Disinflation, now these are two terms and they mean different, okay. Disinflation basically is only a reduction in the value of or in the level of inflation. So inflation was in the short term. So suppose inflation on a month-to-month basis was going on as 5%. In the next month, it comes to 4%. So it's still positive. Prices have still gone up, right? But the number is smaller. There's still an increase in prices, but by a lesser amount. Okay. Deflation, on the other hand, is negative inflation. Okay, less than zero, which means that over a period of time, prices are going down, right? So if last year your CPI was 100, right? Or say if the last year your CPI was say 110, right? Now this year or over a period of time, it's going below and below that. So when it's going below that, you will see that say 105 minus, sorry, 105 minus 110 upon 110 into 100. If this is the formula, then you will see that this number comes out to be negative, right? So this is negative, and that means that it is deflation. The inflation is negative. So these two terms look similar, but they are very different. Alright, so that's it from my side. I hope some of the basic things about inflation are clear. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.